The Galactic School for Interstellar Integration, or GSII, was a marvel that seemed to defy reality. Ellie Thatcher, at 12 years old, had seen nothing like it in her life. She had heard stories of alien worlds, of distant planets with strange skies and technology beyond human comprehension, but standing here at the entrance to her new school, it felt more surreal than anything she'd ever imagined. GSI occupied an entire artificial planet, an architectural feat designed by some ancient alien race long before humans had even evolved. Sprawling spires stretched skyward, adorned with shimmering symbols that glowed faintly in the blue-green atmosphere. Pathways arched through the air, looping in dizzying spirals, leading to countless buildings that seemed to shift and adjust with each passing moment. Every student was fitted with a small hover device, which floated them seamlessly from one level to another, gliding through the air like creatures from a dream. Ellie, who'd just gotten the hang of using Earth's standard transport pods, felt disoriented and clumsy with her hover device, which she struggled to control as her eyes darted between the buildings, lights, and pulsing, alien flora lining the walkways. Her awe was quickly tempered by self-consciousness. Ellie was the only human here. Her mother, a diplomat for Earth's fledgling alliance with the Galactic Assembly, had been thrilled about her post at the Assembly's headquarters. And while Ellie had felt a surge of excitement when her mother had announced they'd be moving to GSI's home planet, the reality of it sank in the moment she arrived. She could feel eyes on her, could see the students around her whispering and staring at her plain clothes, her wild red hair, and her human features. She felt small in a way she'd never felt before. She was different, and the difference was all too glaring. Ellie squared her shoulders, telling herself not to let it get to her. She'd been the new kid enough times on Earth to know the drill: keep your head up, don't react to the whispers, and try to find at least one friendly face. But as she made her way to her first class, it became clear that this wasn't like any of her previous experiences. The students here weren't just curious, they seemed almost bemused by her, as though she were an ancient relic brought to life. Ellie's first few classes passed in a blur of strange sights and sounds. Classrooms were equipped with holographic displays that reacted to the slightest thought or motion. Information was exchanged in ways she couldn't fathom. Some students communicated in flashes of color or a series of musical notes, while others used mind-linked devices to exchange complex ideas in seconds. Ellie, armed with her Earth notebooks, pencils, and a paper book, felt hopelessly out of place. When she tried to answer questions or contribute, there was often an awkward silence, as though her words had somehow arrived from an entirely different dimension. Her antique school supplies, which she'd never given a second thought to on Earth, became objects of ridicule, with students glancing at her paper notebooks and snickering. The worst, though, was combat training. As part of GSII's commitment to self-defense education, all students were required to learn basic martial arts and combat techniques unique to their species. The class was one of the most popular, with students eager to showcase the skills that set their species apart. To them, combat was a game, an art, a chance to impress. But to Ellie, it was a nightmare. She was smaller, weaker, and painfully unskilled compared to her classmates, who seemed born for this sort of thing. Each alien she faced had some unique advantage: some had extra limbs, others had scales as hard as armor, and a few had speed that bordered on supernatural. Ellie's insecurities didn't go unnoticed by Zathak, a Thrakian student who had taken an instant dislike to her. Zathak was one of the strongest students in her class, his body covered in silver scales that shimmered like armor, and he moved with a speed and precision that made him the favorite in every sparring match. He was a natural leader, the son of a high-ranking Thrakian war general, and he was used to being admired and feared. Zathak's confidence bordered on arrogance, and he looked at Ellie with a mixture of amusement and disdain. One day in combat class, the instructor, a tall, armored creature with a voice that crackled like static, paired Ellie with Zathak for a demonstration. Ellie felt her heart sink as she faced him across the training mat. Zathak's lips curled into a smirk, and the instructor gave the signal. Before Ellie could even blink, Zathak lunged at her, his movements a blur of speed and power. She barely had time to brace herself before she was slammed onto the mat, pain radiating through her body as Zathak stood over her, his smirk widening. The class erupted in laughter, their voices mingling in a cacophony of clicks, hisses, and strange, guttural sounds that echoed around the training hall. Ellie could feel the sting of tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Zathek's taunts only grew bolder after that day, his voice a constant presence in her mind, reminding her of how outmatched she was, how little she belonged here. Maybe Earthlings should stick to their own kind, he sneered one afternoon. You're clearly not cut out for this. The words echoed in her mind long after the class ended. When she returned to her quarters that evening, she collapsed onto her bed, staring up at the strange, glowing constellations visible through her window. She missed Earth so much it hurt her friends, her neighborhood, the small comforts of home that she'd taken for granted. She missed her father's steady voice, his warmth and strength. Her father had been a martial artist, and he'd taught her a few basics when she was younger. She remembered watching him practice in their backyard, his movements slow and controlled, each one flowing into the next. He'd called it jiu-jitsu, a martial art that focused on using an opponent's strength against them, and he'd told her it was a way to balance the scales when facing larger opponents. Ellie sat up, her gaze falling on a small, worn book sitting on her desk, the jiu-jitsu manual her father had given her before she left for GSAI. She hadn't touched it since she'd arrived, thinking it was useless here among alien students with abilities far beyond her own. But now, a spark of determination flickered within her. She might not have claws or scales or super speed, but she had her own kind of strength. She could train, she could learn, and maybe just maybe she could find a way to hold her own. The next morning, Ellie woke up early, sneaking down to an empty training room to practice. She spent hours running through the moves she remembered, each one etched into her mind from years of watching her father. She practiced takedowns, escapes, and holds, each movement sharp and precise. She knew she couldn't rely on brute force, she had to be smart, to use her opponent's strength against them. She drilled herself relentlessly, pushing her body to its limits, determined to prove herself to herself, and to everyone who thought she didn't belong here. Over the following weeks, Ellie's progress was slow but steady. In combat class, she began lasting longer in sparring matches, dodging attacks she once couldn't escape, slipping out of holds that used to trap her. Her confidence grew with each small victory, each successful escape, and she could see the respect beginning to flicker in her classmates' eyes. Even the instructor, who had once looked at her with pity, began to take notice, watching her with a faint hint of approval. But Zathek didn't take kindly to her progress. He watched her with narrowed eyes, his smirk replaced by a scowl as he saw her gaining confidence. His taunts became sharper, his jabs more personal, and Ellie could feel the weight of his resentment pressing down on her. He wasn't just trying to humiliate her anymore, he was trying to break her. And when he publicly challenged her to face him in the annual combat tournament, she knew he was setting her up for a final, crushing defeat. Ellie felt a surge of fear at the thought of facing Zathek in the tournament. She knew she wasn't ready, that he was stronger, faster, and more skilled than she could hope to be. But as she looked around at the students who were watching, waiting to see if she would accept, something inside her hardened. She'd come too far, fought too hard, to back down now. With a steady voice that surprised even herself, she looked him in the eye and said, "I'll be there." The days leading up to the tournament were a blur of training and preparation. Ellie practiced harder than ever, waking up at dawn to run through her drills, each movement becoming smoother, sharper, more instinctive. She visualized her match with Zathek, imagining every possible scenario, every move he might make, and preparing herself to counter each one. She knew she couldn't match his strength, but she could use his own force against him, exploiting his arrogance, his overconfidence, his tendency to underestimate her. The day of the tournament arrived with a crackling energy in the air. The arena was packed, students and instructors crowding the stands, their voices echoing off the walls in a deafening roar. Ellie stood at the edge of the ring, her heart pounding, her hands shaking slightly as she faced Zathek across the arena. He looked as smug as ever, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of an easy victory. The signal sounded, and Zathek moved. He charged at her with his usual speed and power, his silver scales glinting under the arena lights. But Ellie was ready. She sidestepped, her movements fluid, and used his momentum to redirect him, sending him stumbling forward. She heard gasps from the crowd as he regained his balance, his face twisting in frustration. He charged again, his attacks becoming wilder, more reckless, but Ellie stayed calm, deflecting his blows, using her smaller size to slip past his defenses. She could see the anger building in his eyes, and she knew she was getting to him. The fight continued, each of Zathek's attacks more desperate than the last, his composure slipping as Ellie evaded him again and again. She could feel the energy of the crowd, their disbelief turning to awe as she held her own against one of the strongest fighters in the school. And finally, with one last, well-timed move, she brought him down, pinning him in a hold he couldn't escape. The arena fell silent, the air thick with shock and disbelief. Ellie released her hold and stood, breathing hard, her face flushed but triumphant. Zathik lay on the ground, his pride shattered, his face a mask of humiliation. Slowly, the silence gave way to applause, a sound that grew and swelled until it filled the entire arena. Ellie felt a surge of pride and relief as she looked around, seeing the respect in her classmates' eyes. She had done it. She had proven herself, not just to them, but to herself. From that day on, Ellie was no longer just the little earthling. She was Ellie Thatcher, the human who had taken on the galaxy's best and won. Her reputation spread, and students from across the school began to seek her out, curious about the martial art she had used to defeat Zathik. Her once lonely dorm room transformed into a gathering place, a mini dojo where students of all species practiced jiu-jitsu under her guidance. Ellie's journey at GSII was far from over, and she knew she would face more challenges, more tests of her strength and determination. But she had found her place, her purpose, and her pride. She was no longer an outsider, no longer just a human in an alien world. She was a warrior, a leader, a symbol of resilience and strength. And as she walked through the halls of GSII, her head held high, she knew that whatever the future held, she would face it with courage, strength, and an unbreakable spirit.